rectify it? And are there any long-term problems that both India and China will face in the financial system? Because, as I said, if India and China are not to go the way of Latin America and East Asia, then we'll have to have a developed financial system and replicate what Europe and the United States did, by which they were able to not only become developed but stay developed without succumbing to a major crisis. Now, first of all, the question on impact on exports. Let me say, an economic system, I think I'd like to put it on blackboard. Yeah. Got to keep this in mind. Those of you far away, if you can't see, it doesn't matter. You can see it in my book, or I'll read out. This is capital, and I put an arrow here. Oh, my phone's also touching. Forget every time. And this is labor. The Americans write that without a U. And this is innovation and technology. Yeah. Oh, okay. Yeah, that's okay there. And then you have infrastructure. So capital has to combine with labor, and with the help of innovation and technology and infrastructure. And this is infrastructure is not just simple physical roads and all that. Of course, I will put physical, and then financial, and then human, and then social. These are 4 different types of infrastructures. And the physical, of course, is energy, transport, construction, telecom. And then the financial, of course, is intermediation, architecture, prudential norms, etc. Then the humans is courts, bureaucracy, laws, governance. And social, of course, is health, education, environment, safety standards, safety nets, etc. And all this together then impact on growth, and poverty, and then structural changes. Structural changes means growth of agriculture vis-a-vis industry, vis-a-vis services, and then productivity. So if you have good infrastructure, you have good productivity, and of course that will depend on the innovation. And for between the periods 1900 and 1985, the US growth was 85% due to productivity growth. For which Robert Solow of MIT got a Nobel Prize. This is the key thing. Whereas in India and China it is running at 35%. Most of East Asia, the estimates vary. If you go by the latest fellow, MIT professor who got the Nobel Prize, what's his name? Krugman, yeah, Krugman. Krugman says, well, it is 20%, but some people say 40%. But in any case, Krugman says that East Asia's growth was more perspiration than inspiration, whereas the American growth is more inspiration than perspiration. That is, just having more capital, more labor doesn't solve problem. I would say China would be also in the same region. Both have things. So the crucial thing is not to worry too much about this, but you need this as a part of your infrastructure, just as you need physical, human, and social infrastructure. So when you are looking at economic growth, you have to look at the whole picture and not just at the question of whether you have enough money. It's not enough to have enough money. You need much more than money. So this is the first thing I would like to say. The impact is now being felt by India and China on exports. India's export growth rate has fallen. Exports have fallen. The amount of exports we exported has fallen in October by 12%, by November by 12%, and probably December would be also somewhere in that region. So there has been a definite impact on it. So the first impact on both China and India is a decline in exports. This impacts India less than China. And I will, during the course of the lecture, go into the question of why exports are so crucial for China. It is the engine of growth. It's not the engine of growth for India. The engine of growth for India is domestic demand. But in China, exports are crucial, and anything that hurts exports will hurt China very, very badly in more ways than just simply loss of revenue or foreign exchange, in a fundamental way, which I'll come to a little later. Now, of course, then what will happen is, since you cannot cut imports, therefore trade gap will widen, and as a consequence, the foreign exchange reserves will also deplete. So these are the first set of impacts. The second impact that has taken place is because of the illiquidity or the liquidity crunch in Western countries, FDI flows has declined. And of course, in India, we relied heavily in the last 2 years or 3 years on foreign investment through institutions, foreign institutions, that is the portfolio money. And the portfolio money largely, almost 58% due to participatory notes, that has contracted. So our foreign exchange has reduced. Some of you should do this as a project at home as to whether we have adequate foreign reserves to begin with. We were very proud that we had $300 billion. China had almost $1 trillion. But is that enough? You've got to look at it in greater depth. First of all, out of the amount of foreign exchange India and China have, subtract out 6 months, or maybe you can be a little more liberal and say, all right, 4 months. 4 months of imports, 4 months of imports, how much it will cost at the present rate of imports, subtract it out. Then subtract out statutory payments. You've taken a loan from abroad, some of it short term, some of it ECB, some of it from the IMF, some of it from World Bank, some of it from other governments. All these installment payments for the year are subtracted out. This is the amortization, so to speak, should be subtracted out. Then you subtract out. Then with the residual, you look at some of the speculative changes that might take place, foreign exchange going up and down, so on, and you subtract out that. Then see if there's anything left. Then you can say, if there is substantial amount left, then you say, yes, you've got lots of foreign exchange. According to me, if you also, in the case of India, remove the NRIs, because the NRIs in 1990, the crisis was, people said it was caused by the Gulf War. No, it was caused by our NRIs. They are pulled out. Our NRIs are, they may be Indians in color and Indians in outlook and Indians by descent. But when it comes to this, they are just like every other businessman in the world. So the word got around that the VP Singh government has led the country to near bankruptcy. They pulled out the money. They pulled out a couple of $1 billion and literally left us in the soup. So therefore, NRI's money should be treated like any other money coming from abroad. Not to expect that the NRIs will have special consideration for India. And if you subtract out that, the interest payments, all these things you subtract out, you will find that India has barely a surplus. And China has a surplus, but even China, if you remove the speculative component of the money and the round tripping that takes place, because some of the money comes from China, goes to Hong Kong, gets converted, just like we also have. We have through participatory notes coming back, through Mauritius route coming back, but not so much compared to China. China is much worse. So if you take out that money also, China is also, all this $1 trillion is a lot of hot air. It's running on a thin razor's edge. And therefore, foreign exchange, further depletion of foreign exchange reserves is a crisis matter. We have also, unlike China, because China doesn't have much software outsourcing, and its export earnings from software is not so high. India has been affected in the IT sector in getting demands from abroad, and the outsourcing demand, these have been affected. And so not only the balance of trade, but the balance of payments too has been, the deficit is increased. There's a current account deficit, which is now running at 3% of GDP, minus 3% GDP, which is high. 2% should be the limit. So in China still they have a near surplus, but it may go negative very soon for the first time in many, many years. Now, in India, so that's the fourth impact. The first is the exports, second is the FDI, no, this is the third, the information technology. The fourth impact is that in India, one or two banks may collapse. ICICI Bank, because ICICI Bank, what it has been doing, has been taking money from abroad, short-term loans from abroad, and giving long-term loans here. And there's a big interest rate differential. And the Indians, of course, much higher interest rate. And then to repay that money, they've been taking another short-term loan, I mean a junior Madoff type of situation, and paying back that. And now they are not getting that money. But the government of India has been liberal and given them an injection, and therefore they're surviving. But maximum a bank or two, and I would say that the regulations that were set in
place after, much after, in fact, during the Narasimha Rao period, when Tarapura Committee, etc. was set up, these regulations have been intelligent use. Earlier on, it was a sledgehammer set of regulations when we had socialism. But after the economic reform brought, these regulations that have been brought in, scientifically calibrated, particularly thanks to the Tarapura Committee, Tarapura Wala Committee, I think have played a very good role in seeing that our banks are not exposed to these bubbles. So this is the situation overall. Now, nevertheless, as far as the American-induced crisis is concerned, the damage to both our economies, China and India, is manageable. In India, we would not have had anything at all worth speaking about. Of course, those other things of falling in demand and exports, etc., would be there. But those are manageable. The unmanageable part is the sharp decline in foreign exchange reserves and the infusion of money from abroad, which had got our stock market used to huge highs. I think they crossed what, 20,000, 22,000. It's a pure rigged operation. Anytime you want to earn money, you pull out and then it goes up, and then, the other way around, and then when you want to cash in, you sell. This rigging had been going on. Now that rigging is not so easy, but I believe now the stock market is bottoming out, and there are other good signs also. The diamond industry is now getting back into business. Those who are laid off are being called back, and so on. So that it's manageable, and I don't think that it's because of any economic policy as such. It's because Indians are saving habits conscious. They feel guilty when they take credit. There's a psychological barrier to a credit spree, living beyond your means. The Indians save a large amount of their incomes, and this saving habit, which is there in China too, of the households, is being a cushion against of people going into bankruptcy. In China, in America, the rate of savings is minus the pension funds contribution is negative. So if you are unable to pay, you just can't dip into your savings. Secondly, India, family system is very strong, and globalization is having an impact on it, but we should try and prevent that. The family system looks after people. If some brother or sister is unemployed, the others tend to look after it. The family is a great shock absorber, and same thing is true of China. So that's another great advantage that is. The third, as I mentioned already, banks are subject to regulations, and these regulations have mattered. In the case of China, the regulations are poor, but China has got a huge commitment that no matter whichever bank, there are only 4 major state banks, and any of those banks have a deficit or NPLs, then this state of China, the budget of China, will make provisions for recapitalization of the banks. They have been recapitalizing to the extent of $600 billion so far. The question then is, India and China have managed to survive 2 major crises, according to me. One is the 1997 crisis of East Asia, which affected Russia and Mexico and so on. But it didn't affect India. It didn't affect China. And the reason that time was that we didn't have a run on foreign exchange because we had capital account non-convertibility. And capital account convertibility is the main reason why some of these countries have a problem. Now, let me tell you that in economics, there is something, in Christianity you have something called Holy Trinity. Father, Son and Holy Ghost. Holy Spirit or something. I'm sorry. I hope I'm not committing any blasphemy. Now, what is the thing is that there is something called a unholy trinity in economics. And that unholy trinity, whichever country had it, has had an economic crisis. So one, if you were to ask me, can India and China have an economic financial crisis? Well, let's see whether they have an unholy trinity. And that means they will definitely have. Now, most countries have gone off it, but East Asian countries had that problem, and Thailand particularly had a severe thing on that. Now, you see, the unholy trinity is fixed exchange rate to capital account convertibility and 3, liberal money supply. If you have these 3, then what will happen is that you will have an economic crisis. Because what happens is, if you have a fixed exchange rate and the word is out that it is undervalued, for example, just take the case of undervalued, then what will happen is hot money means portfolio that can come in quickly and go out quickly, will come into the country, and it will add to the money supply. Because once the foreign exchange comes into the country, it gets converted into local currency, banks have to give that currency. And then this will, of course, I would say money supply, which will then lead to inflation. This will, of course, I can say reserves. Reserves will grow, but reserves will mean money supply will grow. Money supply grows means inflation. And inflation will fuel speculation, fuel further speculation. It could, fuel the speculation. Oh, inflation, that means the currency is going to not revalue, it's going to devalue. Why does it go in here? They think, well, let's bring the money in now, and then it will revalue, which means I'll get more currency, foreign currency, per yuan. Take China's case, per yuan. And therefore, then I'll make a profit. So this becomes a speculative money that comes in. It builds the reserves of the country, but then because you have to give local currency against it, it increases the money supply. Money supply increases inflation, and inflation may fuel speculation. If the inflation is moderate, then it will for other reasons, then fuel further speculation that the revaluation has not come, so it is going to come. Or it may fuel the speculation, no revaluation is going to come, only maybe depreciation will come, so let's get out. So it will start pulling, it will have an impact on the hot money, and the hot money will either go this way or get out and create instability. So this is because of the existence of fixed exchange rate.
So if you have a fixed exchange rate and a capital account convertibility and a money supply which doesn't contract, I mean there's no policy to contract it, and what happens is that it encourages speculators, and that will definitely sooner or later lead to a run on foreign exchange. That's exactly what happened in Thailand. The money had gone in and they were getting huge returns, and then the American bond rate went up, so people wanted to pull out the money. The Thailand government said, no, we will not revalue. So once the word got around that they would not revalue and the fixed exchange rate between the Thai baht and the dollar would remain, so people said, let's pull out more, and before the devaluation takes place, and therefore that led to a foreign exchange run, and that's how that crisis started. So does India have this unholy trinity? Well, I think we certainly have liberal money policies. Money supply is growing at 30% per year, 20% per year. And with all this, now fiscal deficit is climbed up to 5% of GDP. When there is a law which says that a finance minister can be prosecuted if the fiscal deficit is not below 3%. Yeah. So now if I get government next time, I know how to prosecute Mr. Chidambaram. So anyways, you have a liberal money supply, and even if it was not liberal, the Pakistani ISI will ensure that your money supply is increased by printing bogus notes, which they are doing in a big way. And so, or some other way, maybe participatory notes will come in, and that will pump in. Participatory notes has contributed to the money supply because money comes from abroad in foreign exchange, and the Reserve Bank has to give them rupees. So, therefore, we do have a liberal money supply. Do we have a fixed exchange rate? No. We don't have a fixed exchange rate. We have a basket of currency, and the currency therefore is flexible. This also is a contribution of Sri Narasimha Rao, which is one of the most unsung hero of Indian politics, Mr. Narasimha Rao, but he was the one who brought it in. Most people may have given credit to Manmohan Singh, but Manmohan Singh as Prime Minister has not been able to bring a single reform, except perhaps created a constitutional authority outside, unconstitutional or extra-constitutional authority. His contribution to Indian politics and Indian economics has been zero as Prime Minister, although he is a highly competent economist and a very decent person. But the economic reform that we got was really due to Narasimha Rao. And I know it from first hand. I've seen him in action. So that's not so. Then what about the capital account convertibility? No, we don't have it. So 2 out of 3 we don't have. So a economic crisis, a financial crisis for India arising out of a trinity, unholy trinity, is ruled out. Here's looks at China. Liberal money policy, yes, their money supply is also growing at 17-18%. Occasionally they bring it down to 13-14. I would say, if somebody were to say what's the dividing line between liberal and conservative money supply policy, it would be about 14%. If you exceed 14%, then you have become liberal, and if you are below 14%, you are conservative in your money supply. So, therefore, in the case of China, it's a liberal money supply. Do they have a fixed exchange rate? Almost. Till recently, it was fixed, 8.33 yuan to a dollar. But since the Americans put a huge amount of pressure, they did bring in a secret basket of currencies. And it was just the Bank of China would have a secret meeting and decide whether they should revalue or devalue, and they've been revaluing. I think now it's probably 6.5 yuan to a dollar. So there has been some revaluation. Most economists think that China's currency should be revalued to 4 yuan per dollar. China can't do that, and I'll explain to you in a minute why it can't do that. Okay, so therefore in China also we can say, because there is no capital account convertibility, the unholy trinity does not operate. And it could have operated at the time of the East Asian crisis had the capital account convertibility been there. If there was capital account convertibility, capital account convertibility means anybody brings a dollar, you will get local currency. Anybody takes a local currency to the bank, will get the dollar. So that's capital accountability. Current account is, of course, your free ability to bring in for trade purposes. But pure transfers, you have to have capital account convertibility. So that's the thing. So we have been saved because we have had regulations. And I must re-emphasize, a competitive market economy is healthy only if it has an umpire. It has a regulator. And the regulations are transparent, not opaque, like in the case of Japan or in the case of Korea, which has led them into severe problems, and they are not in a position yet to have a transparent system. Now, there are also three other important things one has to look at before deciding whether a country is going to have a crisis or not. First is what is called as macroeconomic stability. Is the growth rate healthy? Is the inflation under control? Is the fiscal balance okay? You know, a variety of these macroeconomic criteria which you can get by going to the website. Anytime you can go to the worldbank.org or IMF.org and you type in macroeconomic stability, they'll give you all these things. They're all usuals, whether there is adequate poverty reduction, etc., etc. There are some macroeconomic indicators. Then the question of structural parameters. Now, structural parameters are very important, which the East Asian countries ignore. What are these structural parameters? These structural parameters are certain ratios, which you have to work out, which you'll find in my book. One is fiscal deficit ratio. The ratio to GDP of fiscal. Does everybody know the difference between budgetary deficit and fiscal deficit? All right, anyone answer that question, please? Don't be afraid. Making mistakes is part of learning. Yeah.
Fiscal deficit is the difference between imports and exports, and budgetary deficit is the difference between the revenues generated by the government and the amount of money that they are investing in the.
It's not correct. So you have some learning to do. I'll educate you just now. But anyway, I'm glad you tried, and I'd like others also to make an attempt. Anyone else knows? Yeah. That's budgetary deficit. The difference between government revenue and government expenditure is budget deficit. So fiscal deficit, yes sir.
Fiscal deficit would include both capital revenue as well as the capital revenue and the
Current and
budgetary.
No. Fiscal deficit is what? Capital revenue plus
The capital revenue plus
current revenue minus.
the capital revenue, capital expenditure minus the current expenditure.
That's always in balance. You can't, no budget in the world will have capital, both current capital plus minus current expenditure minus capital expenditure, it will be 0. Something else is missing. Okay?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
Sir, budgetary deficit is the excess of estimated budgetary revenue. Means it is the excess of expected budgetary expenditure over the estimated budgetary revenue.
That's budget revenue. That's budget deficit.
Yes, sir. And the fiscal deficit is the total. In simple terms, it is the excess of total expenditure over total revenue.
We mean the first one is only, that's called, you mean revenue deficit and revenue expenditure minus the revenue minus revenue expenditure is the first one. That is called revenue deficit.
But you asked about the budgetary deficit.
Budgetary deficit is the deficit in the revenue expenditure minus the revenue minus the revenue expenditure. All right.
And
the fiscal deficit is?
Sir, it is the whole total sum of
whole expenditure
yes,
minus
whole revenue, which includes all interest payment, capital account adjustment.
Expenditure minus the current plus capital revenue.
Sir, total expenditure I am saying, sir.
Total expenditure is what? Capital plus current minus
interest payment
minus total revenue.
Yes, sir.
That is 0. Okay. You see, what is fiscal deficit supposed to measure? It is supposed to measure the solvency of the government, of the budget. So what you do is, you take total revenue and subtract from it expenditure, the current expenditure, and subtract from it loans taken by the government to meet the deficit. So the only portion missing in that is the capital, total capital revenue. When you say capital revenue, it includes everything. It includes money you got from abroad, from software earnings, aid from IMF and or loans from IMF, everything, including loans taken by government to cover the deficit. And that is why I say it will be 0, because once you have taken loans to cover the deficit, you already know. So you remove that, the loans you have taken, that gap is called fiscal deficit. It's a measure of your solvency. So usually when it exceeds 5%, alarm bells ring. And if it goes to 7%, it goes to, it becomes a crisis situation. Now the problem with the India is that these budgets are like Enron budgets. Things which should be there are not there. For instance, Mr. Chidambaram said all monies transferred as small savings of the government, the small savings of the government will not be included in the budget. Well, that gives you a different picture. Because these small savings are actually from the banks you're taking. And he says, no, that will be excluded. So, even the understated numbers, there are a lot of corrections that have been done, is 5% already. And you will be surprised to know that all the state governments have deficit budgets. And if you take their deficit, fiscal deficit, and add them up, then the total fiscal deficit in India today is 12% of GDP, which is Brazilian class. Means that we are in the Latin American class.
we are on that one indicator, we are in very serious trouble. So anyway, this is one of the parameters that we have to look, we are in trouble. The second number, which is the structural parameter, is the total external debt as a ratio of GDP. Does anybody know what that percentage would be like? Well, I mean, I don't expect you to know but this is something you should learn in one of your courses. One of the structural parameters very important for predicting financial stability is the percentage of the total external debt as a ratio of GDP. And that at India is roughly running at 18%, which is reasonable. There are countries which have gone to 300%. In fact, during the East Asian crisis, Indonesia had gone up to 300%. So I would say if any time it exceeds 50%, danger. Your countries. So on that, India is not in danger, nor is China in danger. Then short-term debt as a percentage of total debt. Well, that is something which is a very crucial number, because short-term debt means you have to pay back immediately. So what happened? Why did we get the 1990 crisis? Because when Mr. Rajiv Gandhi came as Prime Minister, he suddenly opened out the economy and said, if you want to borrow from abroad for your industry, buying your industrial equipment, then you are free to do so. Previously, you are not allowed to do so. You are free to do so. So people with bottled up, frustrations and so on, which they had during the strict socialist period, said, let's go and buy new machines and so on. Well, they all bought new machines, but Mr. Rajiv Gandhi should have had this government specify that only long-term loans you can take. But everybody took short-term loans, which is less than 5 years, whose repayment is due less than 5 years. And industrial boom came. In fact, during Rajiv Gandhi's time, our industrial sector was growing at 14% and all that. It was tremendous. All new machines came and the spare parts came. The whole industry got refurbished, and so industrial growth rate picked up. But then at the end of 5 years, and unfortunately it coincided with when I became minister, all these became due for payment. And we didn't have foreign exchange because we didn't build up a foreign exchange for it. So when you had debt, it better be long-term, largely long-term. India, unfortunately, used to have only 4% earlier. Now it's gone up to a pretty high number of 20%. And that's danger, because anything over 15% is to be considered as a danger. So this is another indication on which we are in trouble, and this is entirely due to these participatory notes, that we today have short-term debt as a total percentage of debt, a very high number. Then there is something called debt servicing as a percentage of GDP. So this is another number you should know. Debt service. How much do you have to pay back every year for your obligations for having taken a loan? You can't default on those. If you default on those, your name will get spoiled and nobody will give you fresh loans. So that percentage is about 16% for India. It is below the 20% cutoff point, which is held as danger for our forthcoming crisis. Non-performing loans. Now, non-performing loans, incidentally, all these numbers are very similar to China. But on non-performing loans, India was pretty high at one stage, something like 20-25%. Till I went and filed a public interest litigation in the Supreme Court against the Indian Bank, because the Indian Bank chairman thought that bank belonged to him and not to the government. So, and he was a complete congressman. So anybody wrote, one or two key congressmen like Mr. G.K. Mopanar and Chidambaram, etc., they would write on a piece of paper, give this man a loan, and he will come with that chit and give it. and the bank manager, the bank chairman would say to the bank manager, relevant bank manager, give him the loan. And the Indian bank went to a huge NPL. And when I filed this case, then notice was issued, and finally CBI inquiry was ordered, and the bank chairman ended up in jail. I wanted Chidambaram in jail, but no judge was ready to do that. So maybe in the future, because under Indian laws, corruption is not time barred, and revive a corruption case even after 50 years. So I have nothing against Chidambaram. I just don't think he deserves to be finance minister, that's all. Or any minister for that matter. But he can't do anything else, that's the problem. Except be lawyers for Enron and Coca-Cola and so on. Anyway, this is after that case, a strict crackdown came, and so many people were caught and so on. So many people went to jail, and after that, there's a lady who came in as chairman of some Ranjana something, isn't it? And she did a lot of cleanup job. And today, Indian Bank is having a non-NPL of only 2%. That is non-performing loans. That is loans which have not been, whose interest rates have not been paid for more than 4 months. Indian Bank and most Indian banks today are doing very well as far as NPL is concerned. But China, the NPL is running at 50%. And the banks have eaten all their capital. So every year, there's a huge transfer from the state budget to the banks. And China cannot close down these banks, because if you close down these banks, then what will happen is that they will not be able to give those loans. Who do they give these loans to which are not repaid? To the big public sector, which the Chinese call as state-owned enterprises. These big public sectors are guzzlers of money. But the Chinese cannot close down these state-owned enterprises, because all the workers there, they are Communist Party members. And therefore, they cannot afford to have Communist Party members angry with the leadership. And these Communist Party members who work there, they have wonderful arrangement. They get free housing, they get free medical attention, they get free schools, and they get a huge pension. And it's a very, very settled, safe, secure life, which nobody once having got it would like to give it up. So the Chinese have this dilemma, what to do about these state-owned enterprises. Unless you close down these, because they're all old Russian machinery and so on, they're all out of date. They can't compete. Their goods are not very, very much in demand. But still, they have to keep going, because the Chinese cannot afford to have their workers, which is now numbering in millions, to come out on the street. Because those workers who come out, they can't be employed anywhere else. So therefore, they have to back them and keep them. So this is another. And finally, as I mentioned to you, the current account balance. The current account balance is the current receipts from exports minus the current expenditures for paying for imports, etc., and plus the invisibles, that is money that comes in as service income, as software exports and so on. So if you just looked at goods sold and goods bought, that difference is called balance of trade. But the current account is not in the capital account, but in the current account, where you get goods and so on, and then you get receipt of payments for something or the other. This would be included, and that current account percentage in India is presently running at 2%. Now it's climbed to 3%. In China, and it's minus. In China, it is still plus. And it could become minus in the near future. So now, if you look at the macroeconomic fundamentals, not bad, India and China. If you look at the structural parameters, overall okay. But some of these ratios have to be rectified. If you look at the institutional quality, there you find a fundamental difference between China and India. India's institutions are much better. The Reserve Bank is much more independent. The SEBI is largely independent. We have got lots of institutions. China doesn't have those kinds of institutions because it's been a communist country, and therefore one institution merges into another and ultimately goes to the party. So therefore, in the case of the Chinese case, the institutional quality is poor, and that is really going to hamper the recovery process. India, if you have a crisis, you will recover, and you will recover reasonably well. And we have in the past, in many crises, we have recovered very well. When people thought, in 1965, there was a huge food crisis because the rains, there was a total drought in the country. And there was a big drop in the food grains production. And India was in a terrible misery. Didn't have enough food, and there was specter of starvation and so on. Of course, the Americans sent some wheat under PL 480. But the fact of the matter is, not one single death due to starvation, famine death took place in India. Somebody may have died of disease because he couldn't afford a medicine, but not because he didn't have food to eat, enough to eat. And India managed it very well because its system, its managerial system, this bureaucracy, this railways, all that went into operation, and we were able to do it. Nobody thought we could do it because in America there were two brothers who were working for the State Department. One was called William Paddock and the other was called Robert Paddock. So if you go to Amazon.com and type Paddock and Paddock, World Famine 1975. These two American officials wrote a book saying that world is going to have a famine in 1975. That is, they wrote in 1965. And said that at that time the United States has to decide which countries to rescue and which countries to abandon. So they said we have to borrow military terminology in this. Because in the battlefield, you will not rescue all wounded people. Some wounded people those you think are anyway going to die, by the time you carry them, you abandon them. So they classified countries according to the rescuable countries and non-rescuable countries. And India came under the non-rescuable country. India is a bottomless pit. Even if the entire production of the United States is given to India, even then it will not be enough. And India is doomed to starvation. Not only that, there will be food riots in which cannibalization will take place in India. Indians will start eating each other. It's all written in a book written by US government officials. And I, that young assistant professor, I was enraged at that time. But anyway, the fact of the matter is such a book was written that was nobody expected that India could do something like that. But our institutional quality was good, so we did it. Now, China also had a food crisis which was kept secret for many, many years thanks to their censorship. That was in 1960-61. And 32 million people died. Today China admits to that. Sometimes they admit to 16 million, sometimes they admit to 32 million. How did 32 million people die? And I did ask the topmost Chinese leader about this, who was at that time a very important minister or party office bearer, general secretary of the party, or secretary general of the party as it was called those days, Deng Xiaoping. And he said that the problem was that the workers were sending flowery reports of how well we are doing. Because they were afraid that if they send negative reports, they will say, aha, this guy is an American agent, and he's sending bad reports. So fix him, put him in jail. Later on we'll find out whether he is or not, but first you put him in jail. Now that fear made the cadres send glowing reports. There were no other institutions which could inform the Chinese leadership. So they didn't know. By the time they came to know, they didn't have a railways. India India, of course, benefited from the British laying down the railways, but now no thanks to the British, because they didn't allow Indians to set up those railway lines. We, in fact, the first Indian asked for to set a railway line in 1838, but the government of then British government wouldn't allow it. In 1854, they started some small small railways because, and then they started expanding. Then in 1957, they found this great mobilization of peasants in India, the so-called the first War of Independence, which the British sneeringly call as the Mutiny of India. This War of Independence frightened the British, and that's why they decided to lay railway lines, and then they made Indians pay for it in a way which no investment in the world has been. Namely, they said for 99 years, India would pay Britain a minimum of guaranteed 4% return on the investment. Even though Indians were ready to fund the whole thing and do it, no Indian was allowed. And the British built it, and then just in case you get fresh ideas that if a train can go this way, it can come this way also. Therefore, they changed it to some places meter gauge, some places broad gauge, some places narrow gauge, and totally different locomotives to be produced for that, all in Britain, nothing to be produced in India. So they did damn all. But nevertheless, having inherited it, we put that together, and in 1960, 61, 65, we had a far superior railway system, and therefore we were able to send our grains to different remote corners. But China couldn't do it. And it is that which made China then step up its investment in railways, and today they are one of the finest railway systems. The world, in fact, they have overtaken India. Lalu Yadav has impressed all you MBAs, but you MBA fellows, I think, will be impressed by Enron's accounting also. Lalu's accounting is totally Enron's accounting, I must tell you. You'll realize one of these days, because he has certainly, I will not say that he has not introduced trains. I will not say that he has not improved the services on the trains, but the profit that he has shown is pure Enron type profit. Enron did know, all of you. They created a parallel account. So his is also a parallel account and reclassification and so on. And there's no new rolling stock coming in. So another 2-3 years, the wear and tear and depreciation is going to create an explosion. But he won't be around that time. So as a minister. So therefore, it will be blamed on the future government. So anyway, the fact of the matter is that railways, the institutional quality India has is superior to China's, and therefore when you have a crisis, you will be able to overcome it. Now comes the main question, which is, in what way, if a crisis comes in India or China, it is going to come, so that we can know where to move our 5 brigades. First is, as far as India is concerned, it will come through a budgetary collapse. Either there will be a terrible inflation, or the government will have to say one day, we are not going to pay government servants their salaries. Of course, many people will say the government servants don't deserve any salaries, they don't do any work anyway. So why pay them salaries? But then they've got to eat. So that kind of situation. Why do I say that? If your library has budget documents, do you have budget documents in your library? Must be there. You go to budget and open up the budget documents. It says one page would be budget in a synopsis or something. There, you look at the expenditure. It will be in lakh crores, lakhs, maybe 1.5 lakh, 2 lakh crores or something like that. You just look at the breakdown. Subsidy, that's an expenditure. Then interest payments on past loans, expenditure. Then defense, expenditure. Government salaries, expenditure. transfer to states as grants, expenditure. Like that, you will have about 6, 7 items. You total them up, and you will find that these 5, 6 important items will add up to 98% of the revenue that you get. That is, that amount will equal 98% of your revenue. The expenditure on these would be 98% revenue. Now, tell me, which of these items I can prune? Huh? I heard somebody whisper, but not loud enough. Oh, come on, don't be afraid. This is one of the problems with Indian students. Huh? Subsidies. You are not going to be a politician, I can tell you that. No politician in India will dare to touch subsidies. You lose the election. This is why Narasimha Rao gave you from 0% growth rate to 7% growth rate. When your average for previous 40 years, 45 years was 3%. Communists, to hide shame, said it's a Hindu rate of growth. What Hindus have got to do with it? It's a Soviet rate of growth. But anyway, 3.5%. And what happened in the election? He lost it. Why did he lose it? Because the Western interests who had grown over the Soviet period, those license and quota touts, and brokers and so on, they found this deregulation is drying up their money. So they said, my God, this man continues, we are all finished. Had no clue what is happening for them. So in fact, an intelligent politician would design his economic reforms so that some things come right away. For instance, if I were in charge, I would say, and I had told Narasimha Rao, he didn't agree with me, I said, abolish income tax. Immediately the middle class will be happy and they will all cheer, and the stock market will go up and so on, and you'll only lose 4-5% of your revenue. You'll make it up, let's print notes for 5%, and that money that goes into investment will increase growth, growth will raise indirect taxes, and indirect taxes will be more than what you have lost by abolishing income tax. Do something directly. Or have a linking of rivers project, so that digging starts and all the farmers, the rural area workers, they all start getting some employment. So they see something new is happening. You must always do something which is immediate results. You see, if this kind of thing you do, then people will be supportive. But if you just say, no, I'm deregulating, and then it will slowly over a period of time all filter down, obviously the rich people who have capital are going to be benefited first. So therefore, the budgetary collapse, I can't touch defense, I can't touch police. Is there anyone who would like to cut police expenditure now? After Bombay, nobody would dare. Nobody will touch defense. You can't touch interest, you have to pay, that's statutory, otherwise you will be defaulting. You can't touch subsidies because, everybody will be up in arms. You lose the election. So what can you touch? You can't touch anything. So 98% of your revenue is gone. So what do you do for investment? Borrow. From whom? Your own banks. Force them. Tighten, twist their arms. Buy government treasury bonds. And that's what the banks have been doing. 50% of the bank's loanable funds have gone to the government. And so the government has been managing. But there is a problem there. You have to pay back that money. It belongs to the bank. And anyway, the depositors can create problems for you if you don't. So you have to pay that. Now we find that for every rupee that the government is borrowing, it is paying 97 paisa back as past loans. And by 2011, it will be 1 rupee, 1 paisa for every rupee you are going to borrow. So what are you going to do? You will have to say ultimately, I can't pay salaries, or I will put aside a salary in a fixed compulsory deposit or something, but it will become an unpopular thing. What can be done, I can tell you, but a little later. But first let me tell you, a budgetary crisis is inevitable the way we are going, and recently we have taken a supplementary budget, and that's really going to throw the arithmetic, maybe even next year. Maybe end of next year you might have a budgetary crisis. Now what happens to a budgetary crisis? You won't be able to pay back the banks. So the banks will be in trouble. So you'll have a banking crisis. And the moment you have a banking crisis, the credits you give to exporters and all will disappear. And that happens, then there is a foreign exchange crisis. So banking crisis, budgetary crisis, banking crisis, and then foreign exchange crisis, default of loans, your country is in a terrible mess. So this is the scenario I'm expecting for India in the next 3 years, within the next 3 years. The Chinese thing is that their banks are bankrupt and the government is piling money to these banks. But China has a problem. All this money that the government is getting is largely due to the savings of exporting enterprises. Bulk of it is not coming from households. Households are giving a good share of the money, they put it in banks. But the money that the government gives to the banks comes as revenue earned by firms which have been exporting. But there's a recession in America, Chinese exports go down. Chinese exports to the Europeans go and the Americans go down. They are in a big, big fix. I'll tell you why they are in a big fix. This is US and Europe. This is China. This is the remainder of East Asia. This is India. Earlier on, the East Asians were exporting directly here. Earlier. That is prior to 1992. Earlier too. Then, after Chinese economic reforms and all that, and their infrastructure reform, they decided to export first to China in parts. And China then reprocessed this. Like, Taiwan sent all the computer parts to China. And China put it all together and made it Lenovo computer and exported it here. Okay. Then, for its own industrialization, China used to import from this country. And some of it was exported to East Asia. All right. Now, this is in surplus. This is surplus. What China is exporting is more than what is importing from these countries. This is in deficit. What China is importing from Asia is much more in value than what it is exporting to these countries. China itself produces locally. That is not spare parts, parts coming from here and reprocessing it. But that is very negligible. I'll put it negligible. And much of what is, I'll put imports as M, exports as E. Imports as M, exports as E. And this is negligible, but much of what is comes from here is used in local industry. Now, because this surplus exceeds this deficit, China is making money. This goes down, China is in trouble because that's not going to go down. If that goes down, then China is going down. Or at least this is not going to go down because then China's industry will go down. Now the worst thing is if India gets its act together and tells these East Asian countries, why you want to go via China? You come via us. Then China is doomed. You must therefore have infrastructure like China. You must have decisive. China, once they take a decision, it gets implemented. Here, let's reconsider, Parliament consider that question, nano goes there and then nano goes here.